So recording in progress, nice. Hello everyone. Hi Amir, hi Andreas. So how is it going today? First of all, before we start the session.
Good. So super excited on what the topic is for today.
Yeah, the topic for today is quite interesting because I had lastly a session with one of my customers, and the topic was how can we make public APIs only available publicly, for example, so only from the public internet, and how can we protect our internal APIs so that no one can really call them directly from the public internet, but they are only reachable, let's say, from the corporate network, just within the VPC. Okay, so that will be the topic for today. I will show you two options, how to configure it with MuleSoft, with the VPC with one DLB only, okay, because we will need at least a VPC and at least one dedicated load balancer, or there is an option to do it with two dedicated load balancers. What the difference is between these options, I will show you today. And I hope it will be interesting for you. So I've prepared some example applications. I will also prepare a blog post for our viewers so they can go and just check out the link of the description in this YouTube video, go through it and to understand how exactly it works. Okay?
Cool.
Perfect. So then let me share my screen. Okay, I need to give my machine, first of all, permissions to do that. Check that. So Zoom. Okay. Permissions given. Now let's try and do it again. Now it should work. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So how can I remove, first of all, this really nice Zoom notch in the upper part? Can do it like this so that it will not disturb the session. Okay. So
we don't see it anyway, by the way. Huh?
So yeah, you do not see it, but I can see it. I would like to remove it because it's a little bit annoying. Okay. So good. First of all, what are the options? Okay, when we have APIs that we want to make publicly available and that we want to make just privately available using a VPC. Okay, so there are two options. This is what I am showing you here in this overview. This is one option using just one dedicated load balancer and one VPC, or you can have two VPCs depending, of course, on your environment. So what you see here in this overview is that we have one VPC for the production environment, and we have one VPC for the non-production environment. So you can have maybe a dev environment inside, int, QA, and so on. Okay, so
Michael, one question before you go into the options.
Mm-hmm.
What are usually the requirements of customers that want to have like private and public APIs? Because so usually what I understand of private is you just put the system private and experience APIs publicly. But what are the requirements? I mean, why shouldn't I be able to call the system APIs also from the internet?
The thing is that, for example, you can have some APIs that have a connectivity or a connection to your backend systems, which can run on premise. Okay, it can be a legacy database or it can be any system. And you do not want this API to be publicly available because there is no one that should consume it anyway than just your internal systems. Okay, so that's why it should be a private API that should be consumable only from the corporate network. So there is no way. Also from a security perspective, you just do not want any public client to reach your private API that can, in worst case, access data from your local systems. Okay, so this is a typical requirement for private APIs.
Do you also differentiate maybe between the sandbox environments and the production environments? Because as a developer, I find it quite nice to have access from the internet to the system and process APIs for testing. So they might be also an approach where you just add this restriction to the production environment, but not to the dev and to the QA environments.
Yeah, I have also worked with customer that said, look, for my non-production environments, for example, test, because this is like the first environment that your developers will test when they deploy on cloud top. First, they test locally, then they deploy to the test environment, and they maybe want to call your process and system APIs, which normally are the private APIs, and the experience API is the public API, because the experience API has been built for web apps, for example, or just clients that want to reach your experience API. So what you can do, you can say that your APIs, which are running on dev or on test, whatever your non-production environment is, you can say they are still reachable because you are anyway working just with test data. So yeah, no sensitive data, and then you can just configure the mapping rules, and I can also show you how to do this, so that you can also reach your private APIs from the public internet. But this specifically only for non-production environments. This is possible. Yeah. And then you can say, as soon as you reach the production environment, you do not allow any direct access to your private APIs, which are public and process APIs. Okay.
All right.
Good. So I have created a short overview. So in Lucidchart, what you can see here is these VPCs, and at one dedicated load balancer that is inside the VPC. Okay, so we have two VPCs, two dedicated load balancers. So how does it look like from a flow perspective? Okay, so let's say you have a host, which is api.apiforce.com. Okay, and you want to call your experience API, which can be a lead API. So you call api.apiforce.com/lead/API v1. Okay, and that's an HTTPS endpoint, because HTTPS is provided by the dedicated load balancer. So it's a dedicated load balancer that is your access point to your API. That's how you configure your whole network. So in your VPC, you say, in general, my VPC will not allow any connection from the outside world. Okay, so you configure the firewall rules of your VPC to allow connections only within the VPC. Everything else is blocked. Okay, so that's the first step of configuring your VPC. And then you have to assign a dedicated load balancer to your VPC and say, okay, this dedicated load balancer, I have some firewall rules. I want to have all APIs, so all APIs, or in general, the public internet should be able to access my external load balancer. Okay, so that's like the entry point to your VPC, or respectively to all your APIs. So how does it work? It works by, when you call as a client, you call your external load balancer, then you have some mapping rules that you configure in your load balancer. Okay, so you come from the public internet, you call your experience API, or you want to call your experience API. And this works through mapping rules, and I will show you later how to configure this. Okay, so the dedicated load balancer goes through the list of mapping rules and checks, okay, he is trying to call the lead API. Is there, like in my mapping rule, a lead API configured? If yes, then he would call your API. Okay, and this API that is running within your VPC is running on port 8091. Okay, so that means that no one else from the public internet can anyway call your API. It's not possible because it's running on 8091, and this is a private port. Okay, so it's the dedicated load balancer that will call your experience API. So that's like the first entry point. And then you want to communicate with your private APIs. Okay, and your private APIs can be public APIs, or it can be a process APIs, or it can be system APIs. And that's the really interesting part with the dedicated load balancer, that mules of tasks. So we have this two-layered architecture. when you have a dedicated load balancer and you create one, it will have two domains. The very first domain is the public domain. Okay, that's when you create it, it generates a name. For example, it can be API force lb.lb anypointdns.net. Okay, that's the public domain. And if you put internal minus to that domain, then it will be the internal domain. Okay, and this internal domain is not reachable from the public internet, but only from a MuleSoft IP address. So that means that only when you call from a Mule API, you call this internal domain, it will allow the connection. So everything that happens within the VPC is possible. Okay, so that's the nice thing. If you have the dedicated load balancer from MuleSoft, so you can configure it that you have a public domain. This is this blue box. Okay, so when you call api.domain.com, it will call the public dedicated load balancer domain. So you reach your experience API. And then when you want to call your private APIs, you call the internal domain, which is internal minus, and then just a dedicated load balancer name. But of course, you will not use the name of the dedicated load balancer, but you have your own certificates. Okay, so every customer has its own valid certificates that you need to create. You add these certificates to the dedicated load balancer, and then you can just call your custom vanity domain instead of calling the domain of the dedicated load balancer. I know this.
So Michael, if we connect our VPC over VPN to our corporate network, we would call the internal load balancer, right?
Yes.
Because only the internal load balancer is reachable within the network.
Yeah, so if I try, for example, to call the internal domain in my browser from my public internet, so from my private network, that I would not be able to reach it because it's the internal domain name, and this internal domain name is not reachable for me. It's only reachable from within the VPC, or if your VPC has been configured to be an extension of your corporate network using VPN, then your whole corporate network, so all your employees using the intranet or using the corporate network can reach the internal load balancer. So this is definitely possible. And this is possible using just one dedicated load balancer to manage public and private APIs. I know this at the moment is maybe a little complex to you, but when we reach the configuration, I'll show you the example, you will understand how it works.
Quick question from my side. So I'm sorry if this is obvious. So great explanation, by the way. Two things. So if I would summarize it with a dedicated load balancer, what I will receive is one public domain and one internal domain, or is it something I can configure?
Yeah, so every dedicated load balancer has automatically a public and an internal domain. Okay. You can configure it to use only the public domain, but not to use the internal one if you want. Okay.
Okay, so the concept is clear to me. Now the load balancing itself, the load balancer normally stands for, balancing the load, but here we are really talking about securing the access to the APIs through a load balancer, right?
Exactly. So what this load balancer is doing, it's first of all restricting you from accessing particular APIs using mapping rules. Okay, so using the mapping rules, what you do is you route the request to a particular API. Okay, so that's the nice thing about the dedicated load balancer. It's not just giving access from the public internet to your experience API because this is your entry point, but it's really balancing also the load using mapping rules. Okay. And using these mapping rules, you can then route it to multiple applications. So you can have multiple mapping rules, and then it will load balance also the traffic.
Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot.
I will come to the second version later with two dedicated load balancers. So what's the benefit of having two dedicated load balancers instead of one? But first of all, I want to show you my example application. Okay, so I have built two APIs. One is called simple public example API that I want to call through the public internet, okay, so that you can also call from your home. And it has two endpoints. One is the status endpoint, and one is a hello endpoint. So when you call the status endpoint, it will just give you back a hard-coded message that says status okay, and this is the current timestamp. It's like a health checkpoint where you can see, okay, is this API available? Then we have a second endpoint, which is called hello. And if you call hello, it will give you a response that says, hello world, greetings from the private API, okay? So what is this endpoint doing, or what is this flow doing in the MuleSoft application? It is communicating with my private API, okay? So when I call status, the experience API or this public API will immediately give you an answer. And if you call hello, then it will call my private API, and my private API will respond with this message, hello world, okay? So this is, and I have built this so that I can show you how exactly it works, the communication from public to private APIs. So that's the RAML specification or the API specification of the public API. And we have the same specification, which is more or less the same for the private example API. I have also two endpoints configured. Let's wait for it to load. The first endpoint is also just status, just to get the status of this API. Is it really working? And then an hello world endpoint that will be called by the public API. And this hello world endpoint gives exactly the response back, which I have already mentioned. It's, hey, hello world, I am the private API. Okay, so that's the specification, and that's the logic that has been built inside the MuleSoft applications. So before I show you how it works with the configuration of the VPN and the DLB, let me first call the APIs. Okay, so I have here in Postman a public API example, a collection. I have my status endpoint. This is my domain. Okay, my domain is dev.apiemboss.com. Okay, and this, when I call this domain, it will route the traffic to my public dedicated load balancer domain. This is a valid certificate which I have created, okay? So that means when you have your certificate and you add it to the dedicated load balancer, then you need to make sure that it's a valid certificate and not a self-signed certificate. If you use self-signed certificates, which is totally fine for non-production environments, you can work with it, no problem, but your browser may throw an error. Hey, this is not a trusted endpoint, so you have to accept, then it might not really work. You will have some issues if you use self-signed certificates. In my case, I'm using a valid certificate, and in my DNS server, I have configured the domain with a CNAME entry. So that means that whenever someone calls dev.apiemboss.com, then it will route the traffic to the public API. And if someone calls internal.dev, so that's a second certificate which I've created, then it will go to the internal load balancer. Okay, so now I will do first a test. I will now call my
Michael, in the CNAME mapping, you added the domain name of your dedicated load balancer, right?
Yes, exactly.
Because there is also the possibility to do an A record, so routing to the public IP of the dedicated load balancer.
Yes, so you can create an A record, which basically maps the domain to an IP address. It can be the IP address of the load balancer, or you can do a CNAME entry, which maps it to the domain name of your dedicated load balancer. The thing is that if you use an A record, it might work fine, but the MuleSoft dedicated load balancer is using dynamic IPs. So every time
so after redeployment, you probably need to reconfigure it on your domain host.
Exactly. So that's why we recommend really when you have a domain name and you want to route traffic to your dedicated load balancer, you should create CNAME entries and not A records. So we can check it by just doing dig def api.emboss37.com. Not sure if you can see it, if it's maybe a little bit too small.
No, it's okay. It's good.
Then my terminal will say, okay, this certificate, you see, is mapped using CNAME entries to these domain names, which is the public domain name of my load balancer, which is nonprod lb emboss anypointdns.net. Okay, so this is how I have configured it using CNAME entries. So when we go back here and I call my public API, and I will show you how this works with the mapping rules. So in my case, I provide the domain name, the application name, then API, which is hard-coded, then V1, that's the version of my API. Okay, I can have one version or two or the version 3 running of my API, and then the endpoint, which is status. If I call this endpoint, you see, I get the status okay, success with my current timestamp. And now I will call my hello endpoint of my of my public API. If I do send, what happens in the background, it will call my private API, and my private API responds with hello world, greetings from the private API. Okay, so this works fine. So now let's try to call my private API directly from the public internet. Okay, and it is going through the internal domain, which is internal.dev. That's how I have configured it, but you can configure it as you want. Your vanity domain, the endpoint status. If I call it, see, nothing will happen because the internal domain of the dedicated load balancer is not reachable through the public internet, but it is only reachable from a Mule API. That's like the benefit.
And quick question. So this Mule API, I saw that from the public domain, it's available. Yeah? So if you go through the public domain, so the public domain is defined as your host, which you have just shown. And this is accessing the Mule API. And if you try to hit the internal domain through internet, it's anyway not available, right?
Exactly. Then it's because my public API is reachable through the public endpoint, which is dev.api.emboss.com. My internal one is only available or reachable through internal.dev.api.com. But as this is mapped with my private domain or internal domain of the dedicated load balancer, this API is simply not reachable. Okay, you cannot call it directly. It can only be called from within the VPC.
Okay.
If I would be now connected to my corporate network and I call this endpoint using Postman, it would work perfectly fine, because this is what the dedicated load balancer or what the VPC is accepting. You can whitelist all the traffic from your VPC or your corporate network, or you can even whitelist some particular IP addresses. Okay, so this is possible. And I will show you this in action. Okay? Let's show you how to configure this in Anypoint on the Anypoint platform so that you can understand this process a little bit better. And this is, I guess, would be the most interesting part. So I have already configured the VPC and the DLB. I will show you how this has been configured. But before I do that, I will now create a new VPC. So we can do it step by step. Okay, so we create first a VPC. It can be a production VPC, non-production VPC, doesn't matter. I will call this one API Force VPC. The region can be any that you can find in this list. I will use the EU Frankfurt region. The cipher block, we can use the default one, which has been mentioned here. Then the environments that I want to work with this VPC, and let's say prods. Okay, so that means that this would also be a prod VPC. So I would particularly mention it also in the application name. That's API Force VPC. It's a prod VPC. Okay, and then the business groups. I have anyway only one business group configured, so there is nothing that you can change here. and now you can create a VPC. So in the background, it will now create a VPC. We have to wait a couple of seconds, and then I will show you the next step, what needs to be done in the VPC.
What are the default firewall rules? I guess now the VPC is probably open to the internet, right?
Yeah, we can check it out now when it has been created. Okay, yeah. So it's here. The VPC is available. That's a really good question. So when we go to firewall rules, by default, as you can see, the VPC is allowing traffic on port 8081, 8082 from anywhere, okay? So it's basically everyone can call any API that is running within the VPC. And the VPC is also allowing traffic on port 8091 and 8092. Okay, so 8081 is HTTP, 8082 is HTTPS, and same goes with the private ports. Okay, so 8091 is a private HTTP port, as you can see here in the description, and 8092 is a private HTTPS port. So we are basically allowing all the traffic. And what we can do now, because we want to have this setup of private APIs should not be reachable from outside. So we would just say, no, I do not allow traffic from anywhere. I delete this. I only want this configuration. Only traffic within my local VPC, okay, from this IP range on port 8091 and 8092. So what?
Because this is also I see quite often at my customers. So they just create the default VPC. They set up the dedicated load balancer, but they forget to delete the two mapping rules which you just deleted. And if you have those mapping rules, all the internal workers will be reachable from the internet.
Exactly. So that's really important when you configure your VPC. And that's why I always recommend to do a workshop first, okay, with the architects and so on, and with the whole networking guys and security guys to make sure that how do you want the setup to be, okay? What traffic should be allowed from where? And that's really the very first point when you create your VPC is you need to know what the firewall rules should be. What exactly do you want to allow? So in this case, as my setup is really simple, I say, I only allow traffic from my local VPC on port 8091 and 92. So what does it mean? It means that all your applications that you deploy, your mule applications, they need to run on port 8091 or 8092. Everything else is what you can still deploy it, but you cannot call it, okay? So your VPC would just not allow your API call to that particular API that might be running on ports, I don't know, 8095, because we do not allow the traffic in our firewall rules, okay? So that's the very first point. Now we have created our VPC. Next step, let's create a dedicated load balancer. And we can do the same procedure here, API force. We say we are talking about, we created a production VPC. So we need a production load balancer, and we will call it API force prod. What is the target VPC? This is the one which I've created now, API force VPC. By default on 2 workers, timeout in seconds. So that means whenever you call an API through the dedicated load balancer, and if that API is not responding within 300 seconds, which is I think 5 minutes, then the load balancer will throw an error. And here you see also what are the whitelisted IPs, or what is the IP range that your dedicated load balancer will allow. So that's the part which you have mentioned, Andy. So in the VPC itself, we have said no traffic from the public internet. But now in the dedicated load balancer, we say, I allow everything. So that means that the entry points in your configuration, in your ecosystem or in your network is this load balancer that we just created. So the load balancer is the only place to access your APIs that are running in your VPC.
Mm-hmm.
So when you want to create a dedicated load balancer, what is required is a certificate. So this is what I have mentioned. And this is also the question from you. Amir, you have said, okay, we have these two domains in a DLB. So do we need both? No, you don't need both. It depends how many certificates or what exactly do you want to achieve. But if you want to use the public domain of the dedicated load balancer, you need to add the certificate which represents your public vanity domain of your company. If you want to use an internal one, then you just add an additional certificate, which will be internal for your vanity domain, and it will use the internal domain. So we can do it now. I have created some self-signed certificates. We need to add here in this dedicated load balancer configuration, we need to add the public key and the private key of the certificate. So I will go to my certificates that I've just recently created. I will use the public certificate first, the public key, and then the private key. And there are some mapping rules that you can configure, okay? The mapping rules are really, really important because they say, in the end, the mapping rules define which APIs are you able to call, okay? So in my case, I can say, we can do it really simple. We can say that whenever someone calls our domain / application name, it will call, in this case, it will call any application that is running in CloudTop, but we want to restrict it to call only public APIs. So what we will say is only APIs that have the name public inside will be able to be called, okay? What we can add here as well is...
Question, so this public need to be then part of the name?
Yes.
And can we do any kind of regex here as well? So regular expressions, if it's not in the beginning, or how do you handle it?
No, I don't think that you can use regex here. Not 100% sure. To be honest, that's a really good question. But what I can show you just with an example, how I would do it when you do this mapping rule, so that it can be used not just for one application, but you want to make it generic so that you can use it for multiple applications, okay? So then let me go back to Lucidchart. I have a better overview there with a good example. So let's go here and open this one, okay? So let's say we have, and I will copy this. We can do it with any domain. It doesn't matter if it's the public or internal domain. But let's say my mapping rule is the following. I don't need this domain because this is always fixed. This is the input that I need to provide when I call my endpoint, okay? So that's the application name. I need to provide API that's static. And I need to provide the version, which can be dynamic. So we will do it like this, okay? So that's the input of the mapping rules in my DLB. And it will map to the following application. So for the public API, we can say the name of the application must start with public. And then the application name, which can be anything. It can be, for example, marketing, leads, whatever it is. Then API is static, okay? And then the version. So when we try it with an example, then it would look like this, okay? So let's say we call not the internal, but the public API, and we call an app called lead, okay? So this is what we call using Postman or whatever system. And then the DLB will go through these mapping rules and try to find the following API, because we have configured it as follows: public minus leads minus API minus 1. Okay, so that is the API name that must be running in Runtime Manager if there is no API with this name, then your dedicated load balancer will throw an error, 404 not found. I
So
cannot
V2
find.
will also work in this example, right? So if it would be V2 and there is a V2 deployed, we are going to succeed.
Exactly. If you provide V2 as an input, then as you can see, because version is dynamic, it can be any value, then it will just search for value. Whatever you provide here as a version will be taken and it will try to search this API name. So that's the mapping rule that we have to configure in our dedicated load balancer. So here, as I said, so our input is app, API, and then the version, which is dynamic. So we will say version. And here it is public, the app, which is dynamic, then static API and dynamic version. And the protocol is the protocol that you have configured your API to work with. Okay, so your Mule API doesn't need to have an HTTPS endpoint within the VPC because your dedicated load balancer has a certificate, which is a valid certificate, and it's an HTTPS endpoint. So your MuleSoft application can run on HTTPE because anyway, it's just inside the VPC, okay? So it's safe. You do not need HTTPS here. But of course, if there are some security requirements and you want to have like last mile security that we call it, so then you can also configure your Mule app to have HTTPS. And then you just need to change it to HTTPS and save it. And that means what the dedicated load balancer will do is when you call your DLB, it will try to look for an API that is running on HTTPS. But it also means that your Mule API in your main listener configuration, you need to provide also a certificate because you want the Mule API also to provide an HTTPS endpoint. Okay.
I have one question regarding the mapping rule, Michael. So one of the best practices is that we create for every external system one experience API. So let's say we create SAP Experience API. How would you do the mapping rule then? So if you go back to your Lucy chart, would we need to call SAP Experience API in the URL? Because it wouldn't be lead, right? There is no lead experience API which exists.
Yeah, if you say it's the API is called, let's say the API that you have deployed is called SIP, okay? Then you can just say SIP v1, and my existing mapping rule will work for all APIs because it will just use whatever I have provided as an input and try to look for this API. So if you have an API that you need to follow this naming convention. This is really important, okay? So if you have an API that is not deployed as public sub RPv2, but let's say it is deployed as sub SAP RPv2, then your DLB will not find this application because it is missing the public part in front.
But yeah, I just mean because of the entire naming topic. This is also a question I receive quite a lot from my customers. So if you are the SAP system, why should I add in the URL SAP, right? It somehow doesn't make sense. And there is the question, is it more domain driven? So let's say we have lead in the experience API, or is it more like system driven? And this is always like really hard to answer at the end, right? Because the best practice would be that we have for each system one experience API. But as a consumer, I think it does make sense that you need to add SAP in the URL, right?
Yeah, so it really depends how your setup is, because if you build an experience API, which is your public API, then you build it usually for a particular system or web application. And then you give it a name that represents that system. But of course, you can have a generic experience API that can be consumed by multiple clients, multiple web applications. So you cannot give it the name of one particular system. It wouldn't make any sense. then you can give it a generic name, okay? Like lead.
So for example, for channels, right, like web API, or let's say customer management API or lead API. But in this case, you would need to set up your experience APIs with the domain in the naming instead of the system.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So if you use customer management, exactly, then customer management, in the end, the mapping rules are still the same, you know, because it's just a different name that represents, it's more a domain-driven approach. It's not representing a particular system. And by the way, public is not really, public is maybe just an example, but our APIs are usually experience APIs that are public. So it would be customer management minus X, which is experience API minus API v2. So that means in our mapping rules, we would not say public, but we would say app and then X minus. Okay, so that means only experience APIs, all experience APIs that are running in your VPC are callable or reachable through this mapping rule. Okay. So that's the first part. Okay, so I have created now, or I am creating now the dedicated load balancer, and I am using only the public domain. When this will now take maybe a minute to deploy, then we can add a second certificate. I mean, I can already do it now because it's currently, that's my wrong, not the correct, it's still deploying, but I can show you my existing dedicated load balancer, okay? Because you can have multiple certificates inside. So I have here the public one, which is dev API with my mapping rules configured. In my case, I'm using public, but you can just use an X for public APIs. And now I have a second certificate configured, which is internal, and with additional other mapping rules, okay? Because you see there is no public here inside, because now using this mapping rule, I can call all process APIs or system APIs. So that's how it works. That's how you can configure it with a VPC, with a DLB. If you want to have public and private APIs, you need at least two certificates, one for the public domain, one for the internal domain. And each certificate or each domain needs to have its own mapping rule, okay? Mapping rule for public APIs, mapping rule for public, and mapping rules for private APIs. So that's really important. That's the setup that you can do with just one DLB. We have about 5 minutes left, so I will show you what is the downside of having this setup, okay? So if we have this setup, I can go back to Postman and show you still the internal API that is here, okay? When I tried to call this internal API from my home address, it's not possible, okay? So, but what is the downside if you have one DLB? The DLB is using the host or the domain to communicate internally. So what I can say here, okay, I don't want to call my internal domain because it's anyway not reachable for me. I will call my public domain with the mapping rules for my private APIs, okay? And I will add an additional parameter, header parameter, host, and say, do not communicate, do not use this host, but use the internal host, okay? So now, if I do the same call, I'm able to call the system API directly, my private API, because I have told my DLB, hey, I'm calling you through the public domain, but please use the internal domain to communicate. So that's why there is still a workaround using one DLB to call your private APIs, okay? So that's like the downside of having one DLB, and we usually recommend to go with two DLBs, because if you have two separate DLBs, then there is no chance that you can have one DLB that allows traffic from everywhere, and the other DLB is in general not allowing any traffic from the public internet. So there is no way that you can reach private APIs, okay? But in this case, as we have only one dedicated load balancer, and we have said everyone can call us. Okay, so it's in the whitelisting rules. We said connection is allowed from the public internet in general. Then you can theoretically still reach your private APIs using this host parameter. Okay, but this is not really like, hey, it's not working, we do not recommend this. It is still possible, but what needs to be done that you can really avoid someone calling your private API? You can still say in the dedicated load balancer, when you go back, okay, so that's my dedicated load balancer. Now we go to my internal domain, and then I can say client certificate, which at the moment is optional. I can say, hey, if you want to call my system API, I want you to use a certificate. Okay, you need to provide this certificate, which I've just added here. I'm just adding a self-send certificates. I will now deploy the change, redeploy the DLB. Okay, so that means now that when my public API or I using Postman, if I want to directly call my system API with these workarounds, I will get an error because I do not have the certificates that I need also to provide. Okay, so in this way, when the next time when the DLB has basically started running and I do the same call again, it will not work because I do not have the certificate that is required. So I can use really the client certificates to add an additional security layer in my DLB to make sure that no one can really call my private APIs.
That would have been my question, but you straightly answered it. Okay.
Cool. So it is at the moment redeploying. Will take maybe a few seconds and we can try it again. But this is the setup. Okay, so if we go back to Lucidchart, what I have shown you is here the approach with one DLB. But if you go to the approach with two DLBs, the whole configuration is exactly the same. Okay, you have one VPC. In your VPC, you say no traffic at all is allowed from the public internet. Then you have one dedicated load balancer where you say I allow all traffic. And then you have a second load balancer where you say this is my certificate, internal API domain.com. And those are my whitelisting rules. I allow traffic only from this particular APIs, this API range, or only traffic within my VPC. Okay, so if you use this approach with two DLBs, then there is no way that I can really call my private APIs because the firewall rules restrict that. So that's the benefit of having two DLBs. But both ways work, okay? It doesn't mean that the approach with one DLB is completely wrong, should be completely avoided. It is possible, but you need to add an additional layer of security using additional policies, for example, on your internal APIs, or you can use also additional IP whitelisting policies. You can use the MTLS or client certificate as I have added here. There are many, many ways to add additional layers of security on your internal APIs, okay? So let's check if the application has redeployed. It is still starting. Let me do another test. You see, now I am not able to call my API anymore. It's telling me no SSL certificate was sent. And now it's kind of safe. My private API, I cannot reach it. But it also means that if I call now my public API and say, hello, please call the private API, I will get also an error. You see 500 because my experience API, which is my public API, doesn't have a certificate when calling the private API. So what I need to do now as a next step, I will need to open my public API, reconfigure the HTTP request component and add a certificate there so that when I call my internal DLB domain, I need to provide this certificate. Otherwise, I would always get this error 500.
Superb.
So that's the setup. What I will do now is, so in the description of this YouTube video, you will find a link to two repositories. to the private example API, to the public example API. And I will also add a link to the blog post of the whole configuration that I have done here, so that the viewers of this YouTube video can really go step by step, reading through the documentation and do exactly the setup that I have done here using one DLB. Of course, if you have questions how it works with two DLBs, do not hesitate to contact us, ask questions in the question section on this YouTube video. And yeah, any more questions from you, Amir and Andy, on this whole setup?
No, just thank you very much for the overview.
Also from my side, thanks a lot. And I will try out the blog post and see if I can manage to set it up.
All right, then see you to the next session, guys.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye, guys.